So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of types that exist in Java. There are two basic kinds of types in Java, two big classifications. And really what we're going to be concerned about right now is primitive types. But if something is not a primitive type, it is basically a class or an object. And we'll get into classes and objects later. But basically, a primitive type is going to be any kind of type in Java that is not an object, that basically is what it says. So what I mean by that is that a primitive type, if you assign it to something, that value in memory is exactly what you assigned. Whereas objects and classes, other types that are not primitive types, what a variable really represents in Java is a memory location. It's a reference to a memory location. And this is kind of confusing, especially if you haven't done very much programming. You don't really have to understand this concept. I think a lot of people teach this concept very early and confuses a lot of people, but you don't really have to understand exactly how this is happening in memory. But just to know that a primitive type is a special type that has its value exactly represented, and it's not a reference to something else. And as we get more in depth into more advanced Java topics, that will make a lot more sense. But really all you need to know right now is that a primitive type is a special type in Java. And these are basic types. These are the most base types. Primitive types are not types that you create in Java. They're types that exist in the language. So if we look down this list of primitive types in Java, there's things like a byte. And a byte basically stores memory data. It can store a value from negative 128 to positive 127. It's basically a computer byte, if you're familiar with that term. If not, it's okay. The next one is a short, and a short is basically a 16-bit number. And what that means is that that number can store 16 bits of information. So this would be negative 2 to the 15th power, or positive 2 to the 15th power minus 1. Well, basically, the value is negative 32,768 to 32,767. That's how much can be stored in that data. It's really the size of the variable of what it can store. An integer is the same thing, except it's 32 bits. So it's much larger. We're not going to go over all the numbers on each one of these, but it's twice the bit size, which means that it can store an exponentially larger number. A long, you could probably guess, is double the integer. It's going to be a 64-bit number, which is a huge number. But it's a number from negative to positive. It can hold either a negative or positive value, all of these, short, int, long. A float, a 32-bit decimal number. A double is twice that. It's a 64-bit decimal number. A Boolean is true or false. It's a 1-bit value. And a character is a 16-bit character, a character that you would find in the keyboard. It's basically a letter or number. And then finally, the last type that it's not really a primitive type, but it's treated like a primitive type in Java is a string. A string is actually an object, and a string is a sequence of characters. Like when we create our Hello World program, and we said Hello World, that what was in quotes there was a string. So a string is really an array of characters. It's a chain of characters, but Java makes it real easy for you to work with this type because it treats it like a primitive type for all intents and purposes. And we'll cover string as a special case a little bit more later. But this is the basic idea, that these are the primitive types that you have in Java. And if you're using one of these types, the difference is, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is that it is going to have that type directly stored in memory. So when you copy the value, it copies the exact value. Whereas any type that's not a primitive type, it's really the variable is referring to some other memory location, and the value that you'd actually find in that variable is a reference to that memory location.